Professor X, Magneto, Mystique, Quicksilver, that chick from Attack of the Show. They're all together in a brand new X-Men movie, subtly titled Apocalypse. While critics seem to be split on Bryan Singer's newest superhero romp, fans are excited to see Oscar Isaac look like a Mighty Morphin Power Rangers villain. To help celebrate the brand new movie, we're going to be taking a look back at the X-Men series during the 16-bit era. Join us as we analyze what magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Next Generation, Superplay, and CVG thought of X-Men games released by Sega, Capcom, and LJN. Which 16-bit game came out on top? Find out as we explore the X-Men in 16 bits. Given their varied superpowers and over-the-top personalities, you would think that a great X-Men game would practically make itself. But LJN couldn't figure out the winning formula in the 8-bit era, unleashing critically panned games like the Uncanny X-Men and Wolverine. Unfazed, the Acclaim offshoot went ahead with their most ambitious installment yet, Spider-Man and X-Men, Arcade's Revenge, on both Genesis and Super NES. Released in November of 1992, this was a side-scrolling platformer where players switched between Spider-Man and Marvel's most famous mutants. This allowed Software Creations a chance to test out different play styles and level designs, and it seemed to work, with critics giving this reinvention high marks across the board. GamePro gushed about the excellent graphics, great gameplay, nice mix of challenge, fully digitized sound effects, and a radical heavy metal soundtrack. They ultimately gave it a 4.5 out of 5. This isn't far off from Nintendo Magazine's system, calling the game a very challenging game indeed, that is highly recommended even if you don't like Marvel Comics. Electronic Gaming Monthly wasn't as sold, but did say it was a big improvement over LJN's past efforts, giving it an 8. Ed Samrad liked the idea of having to play all 5 characters through 2 different events, and thought LJN made a mighty fine game. On the other hand, Steve Harris complained that it's little more than a series of mazes that are littered with obstacles and a minimal amount of enemies to overcome. 7 months after the Super NES launch, LJN ported the game to the Sega Genesis with positive results. GamePro gave this version an even higher score, bumping it up to a perfect 5 out of 5 and noting that it has sharp graphics and an attention to detail. Force Mega also liked the game, with Mark giving it an 82% and concluding that if you're a big fan of the genre, then you could do a lot worse than Spider-Man and X-Men. Not exactly a ringing endorsement, but I'll take it. Seeing an opportunity to strike, Sega decided to try out their own X-Men game. Simply called X-Men, this 1993 Genesis exclusive takes place entirely in the Danger Room and sees players switching between 4 different popular heroes: Wolverine, Gambit, Cyclops, and Nightcrawler. Each character has their own fighting style and special abilities, something that'll always be a big draw to the X-Men franchise. Critics were immediately impressed with this brand new take on the superhero formula. GamePro gave it a perfect 5 out of 5, raving about the large, smooth-moving sprites, up-to-date costumes, and multi-scrolling backgrounds that have to be seen to be believed. Die Hard Game Fan agreed, calling it marvelous. Skid notes that somebody finally does the X-Men justice, a sentiment shared throughout the review crew. Other reviews include an 82% from Force Mega and an 88% from Mean Machine Sega. While everybody else enjoyed Sega's version of X-Men, Electronic Gaming Monthly wasn't as convinced. Steve Harris gave it a 6 out of 10, complaining that the X-Men is a cool license, but this game only manages to capture the powers and skills of the best of the bunch, with little innovation along the way. Martin Alessi echoed those thoughts, saying that he was not impressed with his cart very much. The graphics are mediocre, and the animation leaves a lot to be desired. On the other hand, Sushi X disagreed, arguing that the X-Men is loaded with more technique than your average no-brainer side-scroller. He liked that each player's abilities closely reflected the comic's description, right down to the walking and jumping. After gaining a little traction with Spider-Man and X-Men Arcade's Revenge, LJN returned with not one, but 2 versions of Wolverine Adamantium Rage. While both the Genesis and Super NES versions share similar bosses and story beats, they come from two different developers and are noticeably different. And when it came to critics in the 1990s, they definitely had a preference. The Genesis game was roundly criticized, especially coming on the heels of Sega's X-Men. Al gave it a 3 out of 10, wondering what happened to the controls. On a more positive note, he says the graphics are finally done, as are the music tracks, but the poor play control just totally overwhelms the positive aspects of the game. Sushi X didn't hate it as much, but still concluded that this is one tough game that would give the real Wolverine a tough time. Is Wolverine supposed to be a good gamer? I don't know, I haven't read the comics. These sentiments were shared in Next Generation's 5th issue, where they gave the game 2 stars and said that Wolverine is a decent platform brawler, but in the end it's just another platform brawler. On the other hand, both game players and Mean Machine Sega liked Wolverine on the Genesis, giving it scores in the mid to high 80s. The Super NES version did fare a bit better, but still wasn't a critical hit. EGM said that everybody's favorite X-Men fares pretty well on the Super NES. GamePro seemed to like it even more, giving it a 4.5 out of 5. Video Games Magazine also liked it, giving it an 8. On the other hand, Superplay gave it a 60% and said that apart from the brilliantly animated main sprite, there's nothing that distinguishes the game at all. It never gets its claws in. Taking a page out of Sega's playbook, Capcom decided to release their own X-Men game in 1994. X-Men Mutant Apocalypse was an exclusive to the Super NES and promised a new standard in graphics and attention to detail. Much like Sega's 1993 action game, you take control of several of the most popular mutants, including Wolverine, Psylocke, Gambit, Cyclops, and Beast. After so many misfires, Electronic Gaming Monthly was finally impressed with what Capcom was able to accomplish. This is definitely the funnest video game version of the X-Men I've played, says Daniel Carpenter. Ed Semrad liked that this wasn't just another Final Fight clone, complementing the Street Fighter-style fighting moves and great graphics. Giving it mostly 8s, this is definitely EGM's favorite X-Men adventure. Die Hard wasn't nearly as generous, giving it a range from 70% all the way up to 78%. X-Men, X-Men, X-Men. Enough, complained Skid. These aren't even cool characters. Nick Rocks is a bit more snotty about it. Excuse me? This is Capcom we're talking about here? This game deserves a hearty no. That said, he still gave it a 70%, so his no wasn't really that hearty. Superplay was even less impressed, giving it a terrible 52%. They ask a good question. Why do all X-Men games seem to be humdrum horizontal scrolling beat-em-ups? I think we all know the answer to that, because it's easy. Next Generation was on the same page, giving it 3 stars and wishing that it had more characters to choose from. Across 9 different magazines, EGM and Game Informer seem to be the only 2 that liked Mutant Apocalypse more than Sega's X-Men. Speaking of which, Sega's X-Men returned in 1995 with one final 16-bit adventure. X-Men Clone Wars is an intriguing premise, where an alien race clones a bunch of mutants for experimentation, and it ends up that the warring sides need to team up in order to take out this new threat. This opens up the roster in a big way, allowing players to control 7 different heroes and villains, such as Beast, Cyclops, Gambit, Nightcrawler, Psylocke, Wolverine, and even Magneto. Released at a time when everybody was hyped for 32-bit consoles from Sega and Sony, critics were not as kind to the Clone Wars. Next Generation gave it a 2 out of 5, noting that the Super NES version includes more complex moves and features more levels, bettering the Genesis version. I assume they know that the Super NES game wasn't just a different version, but maybe I'm just picking at their words. Electronic Gaming Monthly was also down on the sequel, calling it a big step backwards. X-Men 2 Clone Wars is pretty much like the first Genesis X-Men game, except there are more characters to choose from with diversified attacks. They argued that the game suffers from generic sound effects and other subpar elements. While Next Gen and EGM were disappointed, other critics largely enjoyed Sega's second attempt. Die-hard game fans Takahara said that of all the X-Men games out there, this is the one. Nick Rocks added, X-Men 2 features some eye-poppin' special effects, big characters, and keen bosses. The scores ranged from 85% all the way up to 90%, making this their favorite X-Men game. GamePro and Mean Machine Sega also liked it, giving Clone Wars a 4 out of 5 and an 87% respectively. Despite attempts by Sega, LJN, and Capcom, none of the X-Men games were universally loved. Most received middling scores and the types of reviews you'd expect from quickly made licensed crap. But even then, one stood out. Although Electronic Gaming Monthly may have been disappointed, Sega's 1993 X-Men game earned the best scores from the most magazines. Unfortunately, it hasn't aged particularly well, so I'm not sure it, or really any of these X-Men games, is worth revisiting. I find myself agreeing with Skid at Die Hard Game Fan on this one. X-Men, X-Men, X-Men. Enough! Hey, thanks for watching our video. I hope you liked the format, because we're going to be doing this all over again next week with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'm opening up the defunct magazine review archive to make more of these shows. Also, we're only a couple of weeks away from the launch of Electronic Gaming Monthly's Best Reviewed Games of 1989. That should debut the first Tuesday in June. I also recommend you check out a recent interview with Flump Studios. We're going to be giving away a bunch of Flump-related prizes in the near future, so make sure and stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I recommend you click the subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.